The autumn sun was setting over Millbrook City as Dr. Sarah Mitchell finished her final consultation of the day at Metropolitan Hospital. The clock on her office wall showed 6:45 p.m., marking the end of another demanding 12-hour shift in the neurosurgery department. She gathered her belongings, her mind already drifting to the quiet evening ahead with her husband, Mayor Marcus Mitchell. Sarah's colleagues waved goodbye as she walked through the hospital's pristine corridors. Many of them had witnessed her steady rise over the past 15 years, from a promising resident to becoming the hospital's first black female chief of neurosurgery. At 42, she had earned respect not just for her surgical skills, but for her gentle demeanor with patients and staff alike. "Have a good evening, Dr. Mitchell," called out Jenny, the evening shift nurse, as Sarah pushed through the hospital's glass doors. The crisp October air greeted her face, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter. Sarah walked to her car, a sleek black Mercedes that Marcus had insisted on buying her last Christmas. "The best surgeon in Millbrook deserves to drive in style," he had said with that warm smile she'd fallen in love with 20 years ago. The memory made her lips curl into a tired smile as she settled into the leather seat. The drive home followed her usual route, a peaceful 20-minute journey through the city she'd called home for the past decade. Traffic was light at this hour, and Sarah found herself relaxing as she drove past familiar landmarks. There was Thompson's Bakery, where she bought Marcus's favorite chocolate croissants every Sunday morning. Further along came Millbrook Elementary, where she occasionally gave career talks to wide-eyed students about becoming doctors. As she waited at a red light, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Hope you're on your way home. Made your favorite pasta for dinner." She smiled, knowing her husband must have left the mayor's office early to cook for her. Despite his busy schedule running the city, Marcus always found ways to show he cared. The streets in this part of town were lined with mature oak trees, their leaves turning brilliant shades of orange and red. Sarah drove past the public library, its Victorian architecture standing proud against the darkening sky. She had spent countless hours there during their first years in Millbrook, studying for her board certifications while Marcus worked on his early political campaigns. Through her open window, Sarah could hear the distant whistle of the 7:00 p.m. train, right on schedule as always. The familiar sounds and sights of her community filled her with a sense of belonging. This was home, the place where she and Marcus had built their life together, where they had overcome challenges and celebrated victories. Sarah turned onto Maple Avenue, passing the community center where she volunteered twice a month, providing free medical consultations to families who couldn't afford regular health care. The work reminded her of her own childhood, growing up in a working-class family where medical care was often a luxury they couldn't afford. Now, as one of Millbrook's most respected doctors, she made it her mission to give back. The evening air grew cooler as she drove through the residential area, where colonial-style homes sat back from the street behind neat lawns and garden beds. Their own home was just a few minutes away now. Sarah thought about the stack of medical journals waiting on her desk, but decided they could wait until tomorrow. Tonight, she would enjoy a quiet dinner with Marcus, maybe watch that new documentary they've been talking about. She glanced in her rearview mirror, noticing a police cruiser a few cars behind her. It was a common sight in their neighborhood, and Sarah had always appreciated the steady police presence that kept their community safe. Officer Reynolds, who usually patrolled this beat, had even been a patient of hers last year after a minor accident. The streetlights were beginning to flicker on as dusk settled more firmly over Millbrook. Sarah checked her speed, exactly at the limit, as always. She was looking forward to changing into comfortable clothes and unwinding from the day's surgeries. There had been 2 particularly challenging cases, but both patients were recovering well. Just then, red and blue lights flashed in her mirror. Sarah frowned slightly, double-checking her speed again. The police cruiser had moved directly behind her now, its lights casting rotating shadows across her car's interior. She noticed it wasn't Officer Reynolds' familiar face in the driver's seat, but someone she didn't recognize. Little did Sarah know that this routine drive home was about to become anything but ordinary. Sarah guided her Mercedes to the side of Maple Avenue, expertly pulling over in a smooth, practiced motion. She had done everything by the book, using her turn signal, stopping completely at the intersection, and maintaining the speed limit. Years of living in America had taught her to be extra careful while driving, a sad reality she had accepted long ago. Through her side mirror, Sarah watched as Officer James Cooper emerged from his patrol car, Even in the growing darkness, she could see his stiff posture and the way his hand rested near his weapon, a detail that made her heart beat a little faster. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Chief of Neurosurgery and wife of Mayor Marcus Mitchell. License and registration. Officer Cooper barked before they had even reached her window. His flashlight beam hit her face with unnecessary intensity, making her squint. Sarah noticed he wasn't wearing his name tag properly, but she could make out Cooper on the partially visible badge. "Good evening, officer," Sarah replied calmly, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel as she spoke. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" Her voice remained steady, professional, the same tone she used when dealing with difficult situations in the operating room. Officer Cooper's response came with a sneer. "You ran that stop sign back there." His statement hung in the air, a clear lie that made Sarah's stomach tighten. She had stopped completely, just as she always did at that intersection, and they both knew it. "Sir, I'm certain I made a complete stop," Sarah said, maintaining her composure. "I've been driving this route home from the hospital for 10 years now." She reached slowly for her purse, narrating her movements. "I'm going to get my license and registration now." The officer's flashlight followed her every move, its beam harsh and accusatory. Sarah retrieved her license, hospital ID, and vehicle registration with deliberate care. As she handed them over, she noticed Officer Cooper's expression change when he saw her address and credentials. Well, Oakwood Heights," he said, examining her license with exaggerated scrutiny. "Pretty fancy neighborhood for someone like you. How'd you end up there?" His tone dripped with suspicion and something darker, more personal. Sarah felt her medical ID being all but ignored as Officer Cooper focused on her driver's license. "I live there with my husband," she replied evenly. "I'm the chief of neurosurgery at Metropolitan Hospital, and my husband is." "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Cooper interrupted, his voice taking on a more aggressive edge. "Now." "May I ask why that's necessary, Officer Cooper?" Sarah kept her tone respectful but firm. "I haven't violated any traffic laws." The officer's face hardened. "I said get out of the car. I smell something suspicious." It was another obvious lie. Sarah didn't even drink, let alone use any substances that might cause concern. Sarah's hand moved slowly toward her phone on the center console. Years of hospital protocol had taught her to document everything. "Officer, I'm going to record this interaction for both our safety." "Put that phone down." Cooper's voice rose sharply. "That's interfering with the police investigation. I won't tell you again." "Exit the vehicle." Other cars drove past slowly, their occupants watching the scene unfold. Sarah saw Mrs. Henderson from 3 doors down drive by, her face full of concern. The neighborhood watch group chat would be buzzing within minutes. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she pressed her phone's emergency contact button. A direct line to Marcus. She kept her movements subtle, making it appear as though she was simply placing her phone down. "Officer Cooper," she began again, her voice clear and measured, "I understand you're doing your job, but I have the right to know why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle without probable cause. I provided my license and registration as requested." The officer's response was to call for backup, speaking rapidly into his radio while keeping his flashlight trained on Sarah. "Dispatch, I need additional units at 1242 Maple Avenue. Got an uncooperative subject, possibly under the influence." Sarah's heart pounded, but her face remained composed. The situation was escalating exactly as she had feared, but she knew running or showing fear would only make things worse. She could hear Marcus's voice in her head from their many conversations about situations like this. Stay calm, document everything, and know your rights. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, and Sarah silently prayed her message had reached Marcus in time. 2 more patrol cars pulled up behind Officer Cooper's vehicle, their flashing lights turning the quiet residential street into a dramatic scene. Sarah's phone quietly recorded everything while lying face down on the console, transmitting the unfolding situation to Marcus. Through her side mirror, she watched 2 more officers approach, one young and hesitant, the other older with graying hair. "What seems to be the problem here, Cooper?" the older officer asked, his nameplate reading Anderson. His tone suggested familiarity with Cooper, but also a hint of wariness. This woman's being uncooperative, Cooper announced loudly, as if performing for an audience. Refused to exit the vehicle when ordered. I suspect she's hiding something. He turned back to Sarah, his voice taking on an edge of authority. Last chance, step out of the car now. Sarah remained seated, her hands still visible on the steering wheel. Officers, she addressed all three now, her voice clear and professional. I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Chief of Neurosurgery at Metropolitan Hospital. I provided my identification and registration, but Officer Cooper hasn't given me any valid reason for demanding I exit my vehicle. The younger officer, Martinez according to his nameplate, glanced at the credentials Cooper was still holding. His eyes widened slightly with recognition. Sarah saw him lean over and whisper something to Officer Anderson, who frowned and stepped closer to Cooper. I don't care if she's the Queen of England, Cooper snapped, cutting off whatever Anderson was about to say. I can smell marijuana coming from this vehicle, and that's probable cause. The lie was so blatant that even Officer Martinez looked uncomfortable. Sarah felt her patience being tested but maintained her composure. Officer Cooper, I just finished a 12-hour shift performing brain surgery. I don't use any substances, and I welcome you to test me right here. However, I will not exit my vehicle without a legitimate reason. Cooper's face reddened. You people always think you're above the law, he spat out, the racist undertone in his words clear to everyone present. Driving around in fancy cars, living in nice neighborhoods, thinking you can talk back to officers. Several neighbors had gathered on their porches now, phones out, recording the scene. Sarah recognized the Patels from across the street and the Johnsons from next door. Mrs. Johnson was speaking urgently into her phone, probably calling the neighborhood association president. Officer Anderson stepped forward again. Cooper, maybe we should. She's reaching. Cooper suddenly shouted, though Sarah hadn't moved an inch. His hand moved to his weapon, causing several onlookers to gasp. Hands where I can see them. My hands haven't moved from the steering wheel, Officer Cooper, Sarah replied, her voice remarkably steady despite her racing heart. Everything you're saying and doing is being recorded, both by my phone and your body camera. The mention of his body camera made Cooper hesitate for a split second. Officer Anderson used that moment to step between Cooper and Sarah's window. Cooper, stand down, I'm taking over this stop. But Cooper wasn't finished. She's probably got drugs stashed in there. Rich neighborhoods like this, that's where all the high-end dealers live nowadays. We need to search this vehicle. Sarah's phone buzzed quietly on the console. A text message. From the angle of her eye, she could see Marcus's name on the screen. Help was coming, but she needed to keep the situation from escalating further. Officers Anderson and Martinez. Sarah addressed the other two directly, deliberately excluding Cooper. I understand you're doing your jobs. However, I want to formally state that Officer Cooper's actions appear to be racially motivated harassment. He's made several discriminatory comments, lied about my running a stop sign, falsely claimed to smell marijuana, and is now making unfounded accusations about drug dealing. Cooper's face contorted with rage. Get out of that car right now, he shouted, moving to grab the door handle. Anderson quickly placed a restraining hand on Cooper's arm. That's enough, Cooper. Anderson's voice was sharp with authority. Step back to your vehicle. Now. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. More neighbors had gathered, and Sarah could hear snippets of their worried conversations. Through it all, she remained still, hands on the wheel, her years of surgical training helping her maintain absolute calm under pressure. In the distance, she heard the distinct sound of another vehicle approaching at high speed. Even without looking, she knew who it was. Marcus was almost there. The sound of screeching tires drew everyone's attention as a black SUV, with government plates, came to a rapid stop behind the police cruisers. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she maintained her composed posture, hands still firmly on the steering wheel. Through her rearview mirror, she could see Marcus emerging from his vehicle, dressed in his signature Navy suit from today's city council meeting. Step back from my wife's car immediately. Marcus's authoritative voice carried down the street. He wasn't shouting, but his words commanded attention. Officer Cooper's head snapped around, his face showing a mix of confusion and lingering anger. Before Marcus could reach them, Cooper made one last desperate attempt to assert his authority. "This is a police matter, sir. You need to stay back." His hand was still hovering near his weapon, causing Officer Anderson to step closer to him. Sarah watched through her mirrors as Marcus approached, flanked by two members of his security detail. She could see the barely contained fury in his measured steps, though his face remained professionally neutral. Years of political experience had taught him how to handle tense situations with grace. "I'm Mayor Marcus Mitchell," he announced, his voice steady and clear. "And you're currently harassing my wife, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, without probable cause." He held up his phone, indicating he'd heard everything through Sarah's emergency call. The change in Officer Cooper's demeanor was immediate but complex. His face cycled through several emotions: shock, disbelief, fear, and finally, a desperate attempt at backpedaling. "Mr. Mayor, I was just conducting a routine traffic stop." "A routine traffic stop?" Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp but controlled. "I have the entire interaction recorded, Officer Cooper, including your comments about you people and your false accusations about marijuana and drug dealing." Officer Anderson had already taken a significant step away from Cooper, clearly wanting to distance himself from the situation. Martinez, the younger officer, looked like he wished the ground would swallow him whole. Sarah finally allowed herself to release her death grip on the steering wheel, though she remained in the car. She watched as Marcus approached her window, positioning himself partially between her and Cooper. "Are you okay, honey?" he asked softly, his public persona cracking slightly to show his concern. "I'm fine," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I haven't moved from this spot since being pulled over, and my phone has been recording everything." She glanced at Officer Cooper, who was now standing uncomfortably under the watchful eyes of Marcus's security detail. More neighbors had gathered, and the whispers were growing louder. Sarah could see phones recording the scene from every direction. Mrs. Patel had brought her teenage sons outside, and they were streaming the entire incident live on social media. Marcus turned back to the officers, his mayoral authority fully in place. "Officer Anderson, I want your body camera footage preserved immediately." "Officer Martinez, the same goes for yours." Both officers nodded quickly. "And Officer Cooper," Marcus's voice took on an edge of steel, "I want your badge and gun right now. You're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." Cooper's face reddened again, but this time with embarrassment rather than anger. "Sir, I was just..." "Just what, Officer Cooper?" Marcus cut him off. "Just profiling my wife? Just making racist assumptions about how she could afford to live in this neighborhood? Just threatening a respected surgeon because she knew her rights and refused to submit to your intimidation." The street had fallen silent except for the soft hum of police lights and the quiet beep of recording phones. Even the gathered neighbors seemed to be holding their breath. Officer Anderson stepped forward, his face grim. "Cooper, give me your weapon and badge." His tone left no room for argument. After a moment's hesitation, Cooper complied, his movements stiff with suppressed rage and humiliation. Sarah finally felt safe enough to reach for her phone, stopping the recording with trembling fingers, the first sign of the fear she'd been suppressing throughout the ordeal. As she looked up, she caught Cooper's eye for a brief moment. In that glance, she saw something that chilled her, not remorse or shame, but a deep-seated hatred that told her this wasn't his first time targeting someone like her. She knew then that this incident couldn't end here. For the sake of others who might not have a mayor for a husband, this had to be the beginning of real change. Marcus Mitchell stood tall under the flashing police lights, his presence transforming the scene from a routine traffic stop into something far more significant. The neighbors who had gathered watched as he pulled out his phone and dialed a number, his voice carrying clearly through the evening air. "Janet, I need you to contact the police commissioner and the city attorney. Tell them to meet me at City Hall in 30 minutes. Yes, it's urgent." He paused, listening. "And get me Officer James Cooper's complete personnel file, everything from his academy days to his latest performance review." His tone left no doubt that heads would roll over this incident. Sarah finally stepped out of her car, her legs slightly shaky, but her dignity intact. The same neighbors who had watched helplessly now moved closer, offering silent support. Mrs. Johnson approached with a bottle of water, which Sarah accepted with a grateful smile. "Dr. Mitchell saved my Tommy's life last year. Mrs. Johnson announced loudly to no one in particular, though her eyes fixed accusingly on Officer Cooper. "She's the finest doctor in this city." Other neighbors murmured in agreement, and Sarah felt a wave of gratitude for their support. Officer Anderson was already reviewing the footage from his body camera with Marcus, his face growing grimmer by the minute. The video clearly showed Cooper's aggressive behavior and racist comments. Martinez, the young officer, stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Mayor," he said, his voice low but determined, "there's something you should know. This isn't the first time Officer Cooper has, well, there have been other incidents. Some of us have tried to report it, but," he trailed off, glancing nervously at his superior officers. Marcus's expression hardened. "Officer Martinez, I want you in my office first thing tomorrow morning. Bring any documentation you have." He turned to his security detail. "Peters, escort Officer Cooper back to the station. Make sure he surrenders all department property and clear out his locker. Williams, stay with my wife." Cooper, now stripped of his badge and gun, stood awkwardly by his patrol car. The man who had been so aggressive minutes ago now looked diminished, though his eyes still burned with resentment. "This is a mistake," he muttered. "I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Sarah spoke up for the first time since exiting her car. Her voice was steady, carrying the same authority she used in the operating room. "Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Cooper. Not to harass citizens based on their race, not to abuse your power, and certainly not to make false accusations against law-abiding members of this community." The gathered crowd murmured in approval. Mr. Padel's teenage sons had stopped their live stream, but were now showing other neighbors something on their phones. Apparently, the video was already going viral on social media. Marcus placed a protective arm around Sarah's shoulders. "This ends tonight," he declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not just for Officer Cooper, but for anyone in our police force who thinks this kind of behavior is acceptable." Officer Anderson cleared his throat. "Mr. Mayor, would you like me to take Officer Cooper's statement before he leaves?" "No," Marcus replied firmly. "His body camera footage and the multiple civilian recordings will speak for themselves. The city attorney can take his statement tomorrow, after she reviews his personnel file." The neighbors began to disperse as Peters led Cooper away. Sarah could see lights going on in more houses along the street as news of the incident spread through the neighborhood group chat. This quiet suburban street had just become the catalyst for what promised to be a significant change in Millbrook's police department. "You should have told him who you were married to right away," Mrs. Henderson said softly to Sarah. "He wouldn't have dared." Sarah shook her head. "No, this needed to happen exactly as it did, because next time it might be someone who isn't married to the mayor. Someone who doesn't have dozens of witnesses with phones ready to record. Someone who might not make it home to their family." Marcus squeezed her shoulder, understanding the determination in her voice. They both knew that tomorrow would bring press conferences, investigations, and hard questions. But for now, they had exposed a cancer in their police force, one that had been growing unchecked for far too long. As the last police car drove away, leaving just the mayor's security detail, Sarah looked at her husband. "We have work to do," she said simply. Marcus nodded. "Yes, we do. And we're going to do it right." The next morning, Millbrook City Hall buzzed with unusual activity for such an early hour. Marcus sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of personnel files and incident reports. Police Commissioner Roberts and City Attorney Chen sat across from him, their faces grim as they reviewed Officer Cooper's history. 7 complaints in the past year alone, Commissioner Roberts muttered, shaking his head. All from minority drivers, all dismissed without proper investigation. The commissioner's face showed the shame of discovering such systemic failures under his watch. Officer Martinez sat nervously in a corner chair, having just finished sharing his own documentation of Cooper's past behaviors. His hands clutched a thick folder containing unofficial notes and dates, a private record he'd kept of concerning incidents he'd witnessed. "They told us to stay quiet," Martinez explained, his voice trembling slightly. "Said rookies shouldn't make waves, but what happened to Dr. Mitchell last night? That wasn't right. None of it was right." The door opened, and Sarah entered, still wearing her surgical scrubs from an emergency morning operation. Despite only a few hours of sleep, she carried herself with characteristic grace. The room fell silent as she took a seat next to Marcus. The hospital board is backing us completely, she announced. They've agreed to release records of every emergency room visit following Cooper's arrests. The pattern is disturbing. She placed another thick file on Marcus's already crowded desk. City Attorney Chen adjusted her glasses as she examined the new documents. This is more than enough for immediate termination. The civil rights violations alone. She paused, making notes on her legal pad. We're looking at potential criminal charges. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his face showing the weight of the situation. It's not just Cooper. We need to examine every complaint filed against our officers in the past 5 years. Every dismissed case, every internal investigation that went nowhere. Commissioner Roberts shifted uncomfortably. That's going to take time, resources. Then that's what we'll allocate. Marcus cut in firmly. I want a complete overhaul of our complaint investigation process. New oversight committees, civilian review boards, mandatory body camera reviews. Through the office windows, they could see news vans gathering outside City Hall. The video of last night's incident had gone viral, with national news networks picking up the story. Millbrook, their peaceful suburban city, had become the latest flashpoint in the ongoing national conversation about police reform. Sarah's phone buzzed with another message, the fourth hospital administrator she'd heard from this morning. They're already organizing a community meeting, she said, reading the text. Doctors, nurses, community leaders. Everyone wants to be involved in the reform process. Officer Martinez cleared his throat. Other officers want to come forward too, about Cooper and other things they've seen. His voice grew stronger as he spoke. We join the force to protect people, not this. City Attorney Chen was already drafting documents. We'll need whistleblower protections in place immediately, and a secure way for officers to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Marcus nodded, then turned to Commissioner Roberts. I want Cooper's entire unit suspended pending review. Anyone who witnessed his behavior and said nothing is complicit. The commissioner began to protest, but Marcus held up his hand. We'll bring in officers from neighboring districts to cover their shifts if necessary. Sarah watched the commissioner's resistance crumble under her husband's firm leadership. She thought about all the times she'd heard stories from her patients, particularly those of color, about their interactions with local police. How many times had she felt helpless to help them? But now, finally, real change seemed possible. The press is waiting. Marcus's assistant called through the intercom. They're requesting a statement. Marcus looked at Sarah, a question in his eyes. She understood immediately. Did she want to be part of the press conference? To make this personal story public? She straightened her scrubs and nodded. This wasn't just about her anymore. Tell them we'll be down in 5 minutes, Marcus responded. He turned to the others in the room. This isn't going to be easy. We're going to face resistance, both from within the department and outside it. But Millbrook is going to become an example of how to do this right. As they gathered their documents and prepared to face the press, Sarah felt a mix of determination and hope. Sometimes it took a personal incident to spark systemic change, and she was ready to be that spark. 2 weeks after the incident, the Millbrook Police Department looked very different. Yellow tape marked off sections of the building as workers installed new security cameras and upgraded the computer systems for better record-keeping. Officers moved through the halls with purpose, attending mandatory training sessions and participating in community outreach programs. In the main conference room, Sarah sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by community leaders, police officers, and city officials. As the newly appointed head of the Civilian Oversight Committee, she led the third meeting this week about implementing changes in police procedures. The numbers are disturbing, Sarah said, displaying a PowerPoint slide showing traffic stop statistics. African American drivers were 5 times more likely to be pulled over in our city, and 8 times more likely to be asked to exit their vehicles. She clicked to the next slide. But in the past 2 weeks since our new policies went into effect, we're already seeing improvements. Officer Martinez, now promoted to lieutenant and head of the new Internal Affairs Division, stood up to present his findings. We've reviewed over 300 body camera videos from the past month alone, he reported. 28 officers have been identified for additional training, and 6 have been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. The room buzzed with quiet discussion. Among those present was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly black woman who had been fighting for police reform for decades. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she watched real change finally happening in her community. Marcus entered the room quietly, taking a seat at the back. He had deliberately stayed away from these meetings, wanting the community to lead the reform process without political interference. But today was different. They were about to announce the department's complete restructuring. Commissioner Roberts, who had initially resisted the changes, now stood to address the group. His face showed the strain of the past 2 weeks, but also a new determination. "We've completed our initial department-wide audit," he announced. The results were humbling. He distributed thick folders to everyone present. Sarah opened her folder, scanning the contents. The audit revealed years of systematic bias in police practices, from hiring to promotions to enforcement. But it also showed something else: dozens of officers who had tried to report problems, only to be silenced or reassigned. Starting next month, Roberts continued, every officer will undergo new training developed in partnership with civil rights experts and community leaders. We're also implementing a new recruitment program focused on building a police force that reflects our community's diversity. The door opened, and Officer Anderson entered, now wearing the badge of Deputy Commissioner. His promotion had come after his immediate support for Sarah during the incident and his subsequent cooperation with the investigation. "The first group of community liaisons has completed their training," he reported. "They'll start riding along with officers next week." Sarah watched as the room filled with hope and determination. The changes weren't just on paper, they were transforming the entire culture of law enforcement in Millbrook. Cooper's actions, terrible as they were, had exposed problems that had festered for years. Dr. Mitchell called out Reverend Jackson from the First Baptist Church. "What about Officer Cooper? Has there been any response to his termination?" Sarah nodded grimly. "He's filed an appeal, as expected. But with the evidence we've gathered, including testimony from his former colleagues and victims of his past misconduct, his termination will stand." She paused, then added, "More importantly, the State Police Oversight Board is reviewing his certification. He won't be able to simply move to another department and continue his behavior." Marcus finally spoke up from the back of the room. "What's happening here in Millbrook isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about creating a model for other cities to follow." He stood, moving to stand beside Sarah. "The real work is just beginning." The meeting continued as they discussed new initiatives: a 24/7 hotline for reporting police misconduct, regular community forums, transparency in disciplinary procedures, and mandatory psychological evaluations for officers. As Sarah looked around the room, she saw something she hadn't expected 2 weeks ago: police officers and community members working together, talking openly about problems and solutions. The wall of silence that had protected bad officers was crumbling, replaced by a commitment to genuine reform. This is what change looks like, she thought, watching a young black officer earnestly discussing community policing with an elderly white businessman. "This is how we make it real." 3 months after the incident on Maple Avenue, Sarah stood at a podium in front of Millbrook City Hall. Behind her, a large banner read "Community First." 6-week progress report. Hundreds of community members filled the plaza, including many familiar faces from that fateful night. "When Officer Cooper pulled me over that evening," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the speakers, "I was scared, not just for myself, but for every person who had faced similar treatment without the protection of a mayor for a husband or a doctor's title before their name." She paused, looking out at the diverse crowd. "Today, I'm proud to share how that moment of fear has transformed into real change." The statistics displayed on the large screen behind her told a powerful story. Traffic stops had decreased by 40%, while successful crime prevention had increased. Community trust ratings for the police department had risen from 43% to 78%. But more importantly, not a single complaint of racial profiling had been filed in the past month. Mrs. Patel's teenage sons, whose viral video had helped spark national attention, sat in the front row with their phones ready. This time, they weren't recording injustice, they were documenting progress. Next to them sat Officer Martinez, now a respected leader in the department's community outreach program. Our new Civilian Oversight Committee has reviewed over 500 past complaints, Sarah continued. We've reopened cases that were wrongly dismissed, provided compensation to victims of misconduct, and most importantly, created new systems to prevent these incidents from happening again. Marcus joined her at the podium, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. But the real success story isn't in the numbers, he added. It's in the daily interactions between our officers and our community. They played a video showing recent scenes from around Millbrook. Officers playing basketball with neighborhood kids, attending community meetings, participating in cultural sensitivity training, and working alongside civilian volunteers. The faces in the video reflected the diversity of their city. Commissioner Roberts stepped forward to share his part. Today, I'm pleased to announce that Millbrook's police reform model is being adopted by 6 other cities in our state. His voice carried a hint of pride, not in maintaining the status quo this time, but in leading genuine change. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly activist, raised her hand during the question period. Dr. Mitchell, she called out, her voice trembling with emotion, what happened to Officer Cooper? Are we sure he won't do this to someone else somewhere else? Sarah nodded gravely. Officer Cooper's police certification has been permanently revoked by the state board. Additionally, our investigation led to the review of 27 cases where he had violated citizens' rights. Those victims will receive both apologies and compensation from the city. The crowd murmured approvingly. Among them stood several officers who had come forward after Cooper's termination, sharing their own stories of witnessing misconduct but feeling powerless to stop it. The new whistleblower protection program had given them a voice. But our work isn't finished, Sarah emphasized. Change isn't a destination, it's a journey. We're implementing monthly reviews of all police interactions, continuing our community engagement programs, and expanding our officer support services to include mental health resources and stress management training. As the presentation concluded, people mingled in the plaza, talking freely with police officers who now wore new badges featuring the words Community Guardian beneath the city seal. The barrier between law enforcement and citizens was slowly dissolving, replaced by mutual respect and understanding. Sarah watched as a young black boy cautiously approached a police officer, then broke into a smile when the officer knelt down to chat with him at eye level. This was what real change looked like, not just in policies and procedures, but in human connections. Marcus wrapped his arm around Sarah's waist as they observed the scene. You turned a terrible experience into something positive for the whole community, he said softly. Sarah shook her head. We all did this together. That night showed us what needed to change, but it's the commitment of everyone, the officers, the community leaders, the citizens, that made change possible. As the sun set over Millbrook City Hall, the plaza remained full of people sharing stories, ideas, and hope for the future. The incident that had started on Maple Avenue 3 months ago had become more than just another story of police misconduct. It had become a catalyst for lasting change in their community and a model for others to follow. Sarah smiled, thinking of all the lives that would be different because of what had happened that night. Sometimes, she realized, the worst moments could lead to the best changes, if people were brave enough to stand up and work together for something better.